Colonel Bryan, could I turn to you first of all? You've been involved with defence matters for a long time. Do you think Ireland should join an independent European defence body?
Not at present. The public opinion is not educated to thinking about those things. It's probably educated to thinking against it. Further, no examination has been made, or there's no appreciation of the commitments involved. When I mention public opinion, you say, to have a defence policy, you must have public opinion with you.
Irish people are standing to protect militarisation and increase participation in a period of military law. You should be ashamed of yourself. Organised in order to manufacture public acceptance for increased military spending and participation in the EU and NATO military projects. If it was actually true that the state wanted to just about protect this in an open and honest way, they would put it to the people of Ireland in a vote. But they are too afraid of the answer they would get.
It's the same multinationals, it's the same governments. You know, I mean, the time of national government is on the way out. It's all these supranational alliances, and everything's reduced to what natural resources you have in your country and what your strategic importance is. Ireland has got a lot of natural resources. We've got a very high level of technical education. So we're wide open for any multinational firm with a complicated process to come in and exploit. We've got the largest lead zinc mine in the world. We've got uranium now. Whenever these uranium mines are proved to be commercial, it'll be on uranium mines in the EEC. And also we're very strategically important to the NATO alliance because we're right on the edge of Europe. They want to turn us into some sort of joint tourist military complex that produces butter.
This video is my response to Simon Whistler's video called Should Ireland Join NATO, where he discusses the Consultative Forum on Irish Neutrality, a set of conferences that ran from the 22nd to the 27th of June 2023 at numerous venues throughout Ireland. The forum was called by the Irish government rather than a more democratic citizens' assembly because, as you heard at the beginning of the video, the government is afraid of the answer they would get. This is because public opinion on neutrality in Ireland vastly differs from that of the current neoliberal government that is in place at the moment. This forum was attended by numerous think tanks and other pro-NATO parties, which outnumbered the anti-war attendees. One strange omission by Simon was not naming the chair of the Consultative Forum that he had made his video specifically to discuss. He failed to mention that Dame Louise Richardson, an academic and political scientist, was the chair of the Consultative Forum. Despite having been born in Ireland, she has historically been completely disrespectful to those associated with seeking genuine independence for Ireland, saying about hunger strikers like Bobby Sands, "They starved themselves to death in order to win political prisoner status. The ultimate goal of any war must be to deny the adversary what it is he wants. Terrorists want to be considered to be at war with us. To concede this to them is to grant them what they want, instead of doing our utmost to deny them what they want." Well, the ultimate goal of the protesters that day in Cork was to deny Richardson what she wanted, which is NATO membership for Ireland. This has worked, at least for now. This video will highlight major mistakes that Simon has made which serve to undercut his entire premise, techniques that he uses to make himself appear to be correct when in fact he is not, counter-arguments to the points that he makes, and how his video can be classed as propaganda, despite his numerous attempts to appear to be an outsider looking for a solution. Spoiler alert, this is false. Before we continue with the video, my laptop is running quite slow at the moment, so if you want to help get these videos out faster, please consider checking out my Patreon in the link below, or my Ko-fi to give a one-time donation. You'll also get a shout out at the end of the next video. With that being said, let's get straight into it. If you check out the channel that hosts this video, it's called Warographics. Simon admittedly describes it as a channel about war, and quotes the 1990s advertising campaign of a well-known British wood stain manufacturer in the channel description. This channel includes historical and more contemporary videos about war, It is consistent with Simon's other work, being YouTube channels that appear to take a deep dive into the topic that each individual channel covers. One of his many channels, called Top Tens, adopts a format not too dissimilar to that of Watch Mojo, which is another example of a highly successful YouTube channel that follows a specific formula aimed at getting views by using top 10 lists in this particular case. A tried and tested strategy for many channels across the platform. Coming back to this Warographics channel, however, if you're anywhere on the political left, it should be no surprise to you that anyone who comes across as having a lot of knowledge about war, without discussing or having any genuine empathy for the victims and tragedies of war, that they most likely have a pro-war bias, and this channel very much comes across as having that line of thought, despite Simon's attempts to appear neutral. One of my Twitter followers mentioned to me that Simon appeared to be quite out of touch with Ireland in his video.
In short, both sides were like Rocky Balboa and Apollo Creed at the end of part 1, nothing more than broken lumps, barely able to keep standing. And while, like Rocky, Ireland had won the moral and technical victory, neither side was in the mood for a sequel.
Well, when I looked into his other work, I found that Ireland is not the only country that Simon is out of touch with.
None of his Canada videos are very good. In fact, I think a lot of them will actually leave you more ignorant of Canada for having watched them. Well, the things about Canada, the rest of the world finds weird. It is basically just a very cliched survey of various tired Canadian stereotypes that is probably not worth spending too much time on. He talks about poutine and ketchup-flavored potato chips and saying "eh" and all of this other very predictable stuff. And as usual, the popularity of various quirky things is grossly overstated, and of course he claims that curling is some sort of really big deal.
And in case you're wondering, yes, in Canada, some curlers are celebrities.
When it's actually a pretty fringe sport that most Canadians know nothing about. But it is Simon's 4 videos on Canadian politics that I find far more irritating in their flamboyant ignorance.
A common way for anybody talking about any topic is to use poll results that are in favour of their argument. This is nothing unusual or untoward in and of itself, as long as the poll actually reflects the content of your argument.
Now, these numbers are soft and seem to depend on how you ask the question. For example, the Irish Times recently ran a headline on Twitter claiming 56% of people surveyed think Ireland should join NATO. An impressive figure until you realise that the same survey also reported that 61% of voters wanted Ireland to maintain its current model of military neutrality. Something that would obviously be impossible to do in NATO. Nonetheless, the invasion kicked off enough of a debate that Martin felt comfortable calling the Consultative Forum.
As you just saw there, this error was clarified by the Irish Times Twitter account. The tweet containing the original poll was taken down, not least due to people calling them out on it. Despite the Irish Times clarifying the mistake, it appears that Simon still wanted to use this wrong result, as it would have substantiated his argument if it were correct. So he basically fudges it off as the poll having 2 contradicting results, all because of how you phrase the question, which makes no sense whatsoever and is not how statistics work. Simon is talking really fast, so the average passive viewer does not notice this, and to such viewers he's made himself appear to know what he's talking about because he's used a poll to articulate his point. And as you guys saw, he swiftly moves on to a point that he actually wants the viewer to listen to, which is the Ukrainian war. Later on in this video, we will see how Simon uses the Ukrainian war for much of the basis of his arguments in a way that is consistent with pro-NATO propaganda. Those of you who follow me on Twitter may have seen me pointing out that Simon Whistler's video contained one massive historical inaccuracy, which undermines his whole point if not his whole video. At 6 minutes and 47 seconds, he used a picture of James Connolly's Irish Citizen Army outside Liberty Hall in Dublin, the armed vanguard of the working class, when he was trying to make a point about Irish people fighting on the Allied side in World War II. The picture that Simon used in his video literally says, "We serve neither king nor Kaiser but Ireland." That very banner included in that picture that Simon used demonstrated how much James Connolly and the Citizen Army were vehemently against the sacrifice of the Irish working class in bloody, merciless wars by the imperialists, whether British or German or any other nationality. They did not want this back in 1916, and they did not want this for any generations that would come after them. There is a massive 23-year gap between the Irish Citizen Army fighting in the 1916 Rising and the outbreak of World War II. Not only this, but James Connolly had set up the Irish Citizen Army to protect the Irish working class from being exploited, not only in terms of their labour, but also in terms of being used by imperialist powers as cannon fodder in their battle for capital. Back then, it was the British Empire that used jingoistic propaganda to conscript young Irish men into World War I to be sacrificed in their inter-capitalist wars. Nowadays, it is US, EU and Russian imperialism that are waging new wars to clamber for power on the global stage and looking for young working class people to fight in these wars. In the Far Eastern Crisis in the Workers' Republic 1898, James Connolly wrote, "Every war is now a capitalist move for new markets, and it is a move capitalism must make or perish. The mad scramble for wealth, which this century has witnessed, has resulted in lifting almost every European nation into the circle of competition for trade." In the Manchester Martyrs 1915, James Connolly also writes, "All these mountains of Irish dead, all these corpses mangled beyond recognition, all these arms, legs, eyes, ears, fingers, toes, hands, all these shivering, putrefying bodies and portions of bodies, once warm, living and tender parts of Irish men and youths, all these horrors buried in Flanders or the Gallipoli Peninsula are all items in the price Ireland pays for being part of the British Empire." What Connolly describes in those two quotes is what the Irish Citizen Army fought against, so that the Irish working class would not ever be forced to take part in any inter-imperialist war that Simon likes to make so many videos about to boost his views and career as a professional content creator. To summarise this particular point, the second I saw James Connolly's Irish Citizen Army in a pro-war video is what lit the spark in my brain to look at the arguments that Simon presented and the sources he included. And the more digging I did, the more I found. Hopefully you guys will see that it was worth it. As part of Simon's inclusion of opposing voices in a liberal debate-style fashion, Simon uses one quotation from Tom Clonan's Journal.ie article. Tom Clonan is a former member of the Irish Defence Forces and is strongly opposed to Ireland joining NATO. He offers several very good arguments against this. Expanding on the focus of the right-wing media and other reactionary forces on the Ukrainian war as being a possible reason for Ireland joining NATO, Tom Clonan says, "The current cheerleaders for NATO membership seek to frame our neutrality and our European Union membership exclusively in the context of Putin's criminal war in Ukraine. Ireland has been a member of the EU for 50 years, and throughout the 1970s and 1980s, there were Russian troops and spies located throughout Europe, with nuclear missiles trained on every European capital."
The emergence of this enormously powerful Red Fleet has made Ireland infinitely more important in the strategic sense than it was during the most bitter Cold War year period.
Well, does that mean that we should now, at this moment in time, get involved in an international Western military alignment?
I don't think that follows, no. I think we should keep our sovereignty at all costs, what little we have left of it, after signing the EEC agreement, Treaty of Rome. I think our role is essentially, must be for the Irish, and I hope the Colonel will agree with me, that defensive. The Irish Army is essentially a defensive army to defend Ireland.
But we should not get involved in any way with some international military alignment.
Not if it involves sending a battalion of Irish troops to the Rhine, no.
I will continue to use Tom Clonan's article for the next few minutes, because so much of it disagrees with the statements Simon has made throughout his video, despite Simon taking one quotation from it, possibly because he just skimmed over it and took one point highlighted in big blue text and stuck it in as a point to argue against, without reading the rest of the article.
I'm gonna read it, just as soon as I finish what I'm doing here.
Well, I'm sure someone had the time to read it.
I envy them.
On the guest list for the consultative forum, Tom Clonan said a number of think tanks will participate, some that are funded in part by the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. This is a curious departure, when there are dozens of highly published Irish academics, men and women, who could have been invited. So, British military think tanks such as Chatham House could be seen throughout the programme for the consultative forum, as chaired by Louise Richardson, both of whom Simon chose to omit from his commentary, because including these facts would shed light on the overall bias of the whole affair, and serve to undermine Simon's points. Also, keep in mind the word think tank. This will be important as we move further into Simon's video. The British imperialist line of thinking can be also seen within the programme of the consultative forum, with a lack of vision for a defence policy for a potential united Ireland, according to Tom Clonan. The programme, in my view, also lacks a realistic or comprehensive understanding of the real security and defence threats that confront Ireland, particularly the future of our island in the aftermath of Brexit, and the prospect of a united Ireland. What will the administration of policing, justice, intelligence and security look like in any new 32-county entity? So, the consultative forum does not even acknowledge the possibility of a united Ireland, despite public support for this reflected in the 2020 election victory for Sinn Féin, when the establishment parties banded together in a coalition to keep them out of government, similar to how the old unionist parties behaved when Home Rule was beginning to look like a possibility over 100 years prior. The fact that Dame Louise Richardson is the chair of this forum, given the sentiments she expressed about republicanism as discussed earlier, make it easy to see the reason for this lack of vision for a united Ireland. Simon also talks about the Irish government's underinvestment in the Irish Defence Forces.
The piece was nothing if not a literal call to arms, a blaring siren warning Dublin of the dangers of continued underinvestment. Because, make no mistake, the figures as they stand today aren't just dire, they're terrifying.
Simon mentions such points about this military underinvestment multiple times throughout his video, really trying to hinge the pro-war narrative off of this. Nonetheless, Tom Clonan answers Simon's concerns quite well. We do need to dramatically invest in our defence forces in order to adequately address the challenges that will confront Ireland in the coming decades, and our peacekeeping and peace enforcement capabilities in order to give expression to our sovereign status as a neutral state, promoting peace and the international rule of law worldwide. We have an excellent track record in this regard. This underinvestment by the Irish government in its military is one major point that the pro-war reactionary propagandists, such as Simon, like to harp on about, but they never bring up the historical reasons for why this is the case. The examples I'm about to give deserve their own videos in their own right, but I will give a quick overview. The arms crisis of the 1970s, in which Charles Haughey was involved, was an effort made by Haughey and members of the Republican movement, along with members of the Irish Defence Forces, such as Captain James Kelly, to smuggle arms into Ireland in an attempt to defend Northern Catholics, who were being terrorised in loyalist pogroms. Another example is Jack Lynch famously planning to send Irish troops past the border into the northern state to protect Catholic nationalists against such pogroms, in a plan called Operation Armageddon.
The Irish government can no longer stand by and see innocent people injured and perhaps worse.
However, the arms crisis in particular really ruffled the feathers of the British establishment and the Irish garrison class, and therefore led to major scandal within the establishment media at the time. Due to this and other events, any attempt by the government to invest or develop the Irish Defence Forces would have been seen as a direct threat to Britain. Since then, the Irish Defence Forces has been chronically underdeveloped, which suited the British imperialists at the time. Nowadays, however, since British imperialism has been overtaken by US and EU imperialism, all of which have significant interests and assets intertwined in Ireland as the semi-colony that it is, this has brought about a sudden panic among the imperialists about the militarisation of Ireland, or lack thereof. This has been accelerated by the war in Ukraine. The contradictions brought about by the conflicting interests of US, EU and British imperialism in recent years have brought about a narrative on Ireland's military in a way that really does not make sense if you do not understand Ireland's history and the struggle and contradictions against and within imperialism of Ireland as a semi-colony. In fact, the narrative is driven by US, EU and British colonial forces which control the 26 counties as a semi-colony, shifting blame from their own systems onto the country itself. Imperialist propaganda is incredibly effective at shifting the blame of its own systems onto the countries or people that is under imperialist control. One international example would be the portrayal of the Latin American countries by US media as being corrupt, while completely ignoring US foreign policy towards those countries, and how that gave rise to the conditions for such corruption. Coming back to Ireland, the current Irish government, made up of members of the Comprador garrison class, is subservient to this pressure from the modern colonial forces that are trying to dictate military policy and neutrality in this country, using the war in Ukraine to stir such panic. Simon Whistler uses this panic to persuade the viewer to follow his own line of reason, which a passive viewer with limited knowledge of Ireland's history would most likely be compelled to follow. All of the tactics and arguments that Simon uses throughout his video are aimed at lulling a passive viewer into thinking that this is just a random interesting video about the prospect of Ireland perhaps joining NATO. At the end of his video, he even says that it is up to Irish citizens to decide about this issue. This is an attempt to absolve himself from having to take responsibility for his arguments, as if he hasn't been offering biased talking points throughout the whole video. However, one source that Simon quotes multiple times throughout his video, and more so the resumes of the people behind this source, give a significant insight into the overall bias of his video. On 3 occasions throughout his video, Simon quotes War on the Rocks, a pro-war website with links to think tanks, more on those in a moment, that has many articles on podcasts with a lengthy section on Ireland. All of their podcasts are behind a paywall, but in the middle of all of these is an article on a book written by Paul Bew, a unionist and a member of the House of Lords, as well as former advisor to David Trimble of the Ulster Unionist Party in the run-up to the St Andrews Agreement. He was briefly a member of official Sinn Féin and the British and Irish Communist Organisation. This War on the Rocks article discusses Churchill's hatred of Irish neutrality and his tactics for Ireland, saying that it appears to many in London that Britain was countenancing a dirty war of reprisals in Ireland as the only viable response. It appeared so because it was so. It goes on to say that Churchill also looked at arming Ulster Unionists, eventually the A, B and C specials. This article leaves out the fact that these forces terrorised Catholic and nationalist communities in Ireland for decades, before and during the recent conflict in the north of Ireland, commonly referred to as the Troubles. The article goes on to mention the use of armoured cars in larger numbers and even the employment of air power as alternatives, framing it in the context of Churchill's pragmatism laced with the occasional hyperbolic language. Finally, it says about Churchill's strategy in Ireland, though lacking in moral dignity, was not faulty. This is quite a Machiavellian view on Churchill's strategy in Ireland, almost sociopathic. Suffice to say, this organisation has a very focused view on Ireland and affairs here. If we take a look at the senior staff of War on the Rocks, the pro-NATO bias can really be revealed. If you check out their website and go to the people section, you'll see 3 men named Aaron Stein, Ryan Evans and Nicholas Danforth. The links on this page only work for these 3 individuals, so we will just focus on them for the purposes of this video. If you click on any of the women, it takes you straight back to the War on the Rocks homepage. Founder Ryan Evans is the only one with an actual bio with any information on him. Ryan's bio says he was a deployed US Army civilian in Afghanistan and that he worked with the British Army in Helmand Province. Evans and Stein work with Metamorphic Media. This is their homepage, which says that it works with world-class organisations to build, operate and grow powerful media brands related to global and military affairs. Their people section is identical to that of War on the Rocks. So we'll just stick with the War on the Rocks people section. This is going to get a bit complicated, so I've made a little chart. I felt like this guy when I was making it, but it just makes my point easier to understand. Aaron Stein is Chief Content Officer of Metamorphic Media, a contributor to War on the Rocks, and also Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Ryan Evans is also an employee of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. This is a think tank founded by a man called Dr. Strauss Hoope. He was Richard Nixon's US ambassador to NATO. Big red flag there. In a quotation from the website, born in Vienna under the rule of the Habsburg Empire, Strauss Hoope saw firsthand the destruction caused by World War I. In 1917, a 16-year-old Strauss Hoope was bicycling near Munich when he witnessed the fitful birth of global communism. A rifle barked, a machine gun sputtered, and then the frenetic clatter and stealthy silences of street fighting opened to me the era of global civil war. He later recalled of that first communist uprising. So it appears he is in the communists burned down the Reichstag camp. This article from the New York Times also illustrates Strauss Hoope's politics. Dr. Strauss Hoope, who during the Cold War believed that by standing up to the Soviet Union, a united West could expose it as a clumsy and backward despotism. It also mentions that in 1969, President Nixon had hoped to appoint him US ambassador to Morocco, but his nomination was blocked by Senator J. William Fulbright, the Arkansas Democrat who was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee and who called Dr. Strauss Hoope the very epitome of a hard-line, no-compromise approach to communism. These 2 sources paint a picture of an individual who was not only opposed to communism but opposed to anything left-leaning or progressive. Suffice to say, this organisation, having been founded by an individual like Dr. Strauss Hoope, is a clear link between this organisation and NATO. And by extension, by having 2 employees tied to the Foreign Policy Research Institute, War on the Rocks is also tied to NATO. This puts to bed any notion that War on the Rocks is a non-biased source, as Simon would like to have us believe. Quick side fact, if you check out Foreign Policy Research Institute's financials, you'll see the US government clearly listed as a major financial donor. Also on the staff of War on the Rocks is Nicholas Danforth. Previously, he worked as a senior visiting fellow for the German Marshall Fund. For those who are unaware, after World War II, the US gave aid to Europe to rebuild themselves after the war, so that the US could have capitalist markets to trade with. West Germany got about 12% of the funds allotted, with Britain getting 50% and France getting 8%. Later on, Ireland was admitted to the EEC in 1975, so that it could function as a tax haven for large multinational companies. More on those in a moment. The German Marshall Fund think tank is aimed at promoting more cooperation between America and Europe, or the coordination of US and European imperialism, depending on what way you choose to frame it. To quote the German Marshall Fund website, founded by Guido Goldmann in 1972 through a gift from Germany as a tribute to the Marshall Plan, German Marshall Fund is headquartered in Washington, D.C., with offices in Berlin, Brussels, Ankara, Belgrade, Bucharest, Paris and Warsaw. It also says its purpose is to pursue its mission by driving the policy debate through cutting-edge analysis and convening, fortifying civil society and cultivating the next generation of leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. Its donors who give more than $1 million include the European Commission, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Norway, the US Agency for International International Development and the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, the last three of which come from NATO member countries. This think tank also has other very recognisable names on its donor list, the most noteworthy being Google, Amazon and Microsoft, all of whom have European bases here in Ireland. So naturally, as a semi-colony of US, EU and British imperialism, it is quite clear to see how such think tanks and others have a very keen interest in Ireland. To sum up this particular point, the involvement of senior staff on War on the Rocks with organisations such as the Foreign Policy Research Institute and German Marshall Fund give a real insight into the politics of the source that Simon quoted multiple times throughout his video. Suffice to say, War on the Rocks is a biased source with clear links to NATO and other branches of US and EU imperialism. Previously, when I referred to RTE and the Irish Times, I used the term establishment media as opposed to reliable media sources, when I was saying how Simon mixed these news sources with the think tank propaganda just discussed previously in order to give himself an air of credibility, a thin veneer of balance, and of being an impartial observer. However, in this tweet from Peace and Neutrality Alliance Ireland, it links an article from the Irish government website detailing a funding grant for media outlets. This grant is called the Global Ireland Media Challenge Fund. In the article, it says that the Media Challenge Fund will be used for the purposes of generating media engagement on important global developments relevant to Ireland arising inter alia from Ireland's UN Security Council membership, global challenges and Irish foreign policy priorities. It even says that complete editorial independence is one of the core principles of the fund. They almost sound like Simon Whistler in this, claiming to be independent of these global powers that be, when nothing could be further from the truth. In an article by Joshua Ratz, which draws information from a report by the left in the European Parliament called Rhetoric and Reality of Disinformation in the European Union, we can see that NATO has its own plans for media of all types. NATO's think tanks have clearly stepped up the modes of propaganda developed over the last quarter century of American warfare. As the relationship between the major zones of global capitalism has capsized into open and sustained antagonism, the shaping of European public opinion has acquired greater significance. Washington is above all concerned with the consolidation of Europe as an Atlanticist stronghold. Here, Ukraine acts as a geopolitical pivot. Going back to one of Tom Clonan's points from earlier in the video, Ireland's neutrality was being framed in terms of this new inter-imperialist war for capital in Ukraine as a result of the geopolitical pivot that was just mentioned. Simon clearly uses this geopolitical pivot throughout his video, and like any other pro-war propagandist, there's no mention of Palestine anywhere. Further on in the article, NATO's propaganda is ultimately designed to condition the populations of client states to accept their fate as decreed by Washington. Since the War on Terror, the alliance has shown itself capable of impressive adaptation, learning from its self-diagnosed errors in a mode of low cunning. Anti-war forces could do worse than recognise this last point and get habituated to cruder thinking. While researching this video, I came across a strange iteration of such phenomena called NATO wave.
How do you do, fellow kids? What?
Radio Free Europe transmitter in Western Germany. The Crusade for Freedom is your chance and mine to fight communism. Join now by sending your contributions to General Clay, Crusade for Freedom, Empire State Building, New York City.
As you could see there, it bears the hallmarks of a lot of right-wing, pro-military propaganda that has populated YouTube and TikTok over recent years to appeal specifically to a young, mostly male audience. Some frightening phrases are in the thumbnails like "Make NATO based again," taken from a certain orange dictator, and also Article 5 is non-negotiable. If you feel all of this is a bit, then you're not inconsistent. The chair of NATO was Adolf Husinger at one point. He wasn't only a Nazi, but Adolf Hitler's chief of staff. He was let off at the Nuremberg trials for being cooperative with the Americans and was well respected by the CIA as part of West German intelligence after the war. This background information about NATO, as well as Strauss-Huppe's anti-communist and anti-progressive philosophy, have made their way into the pro-NATO propaganda that we've just discussed. It is very similar to the jingoistic propaganda that James Connolly warned against over a century ago, simply updated for the present day. In the face of capitalists using jingoism and chauvinism to get the working class to fight in their wars, James Connolly wrote, "When it is said that we ought to unite to protect our shores against the foreign enemy, I confess to be unable to know that line of reasoning, as I know of no foreign enemy of this country except the British government, and I know that it is not the British government that is meant." James Connolly spoke about how the British managed to convince the Irish people that the enemy of Britain was the enemy of Ireland. Completely untrue, of course, and that fighting for Ireland and Britain were one and the same. This is what NATO is attempting to do now, through propaganda not always as obvious or grotesque as NATO wave. It can be clearly seen in the modern day convergence of US, British and EU imperialism in its attempts to use Ireland for its own purpose, just like Winston Churchill threatened to do during World War II, but failed. As we've come to discover, Simon's video is just one of many reactionary pro-war and pro-imperialist pieces of content flooding the internet, and it won't be the last. Suffice to say, the worldwide propaganda machine has gotten a lot more sophisticated since the American wars in the Middle East from the early 2000s.
The decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, too. Anyway, 75.
Simon's video is not the only piece of right-wing content posing as an interesting video discussing history and politics to the average viewer who has a passing interest in such topics. Examples of channels like this include What If All Thist, that use this premise of being some innocuous history YouTube channel for the purpose of propagating pro-imperialist arguments on YouTube. Also, one website that I came across that followed a similar pro-imperialist line to War on the Rocks was History Reclaimed, which hosts articles and interviews with a viewpoint slanted in favour of the colonialists and oppressors in India and the US. Much like the War on the Rocks article on Churchill that frames Britain's dirty war in Ireland in terms of being practical, History Reclaimed has an interview about the costs of the abolition of slavery. Again, like Simon, these channels and websites make use of somewhat credible facts and then use these as a platform to push their own political angle. Irish history and politics, unfortunately, is not immune to this phenomenon. Like Simon's videos, if they are made in a way that suits the YouTube algorithm, their views shoot up, propagating such biased takes on various topics. Chemical Minds does several awesome videos about this topic in an American and international context. Make sure you check those out. The information presented in this video is not meant to overwhelm people, but to make clear what biases are embedded in something that claims to be unbiased. Over the years, I had seen many YouTube videos about history and politics, the majority of which have a questionable level of quality. However, it was not until I began digging into this particular video by Simon Whistler that I had been exposed to the level of bias and the techniques used to push forward a particular agenda. What are Simon's motives for making this video, or for having a pro-war channel at all, as it seems like a very unusual topic to be so interested in? Well, in the same spirit in which he said it's up to Irish citizens to decide, I shall say it's up to Simon to answer these questions. However, it does bring to light how Ireland's neutrality had been chipped away at by internal and external imperialist forces since the establishment of the Comprador Southern Free State in 1922. De Valera had no choice except to make concessions during World War II in order to maintain overall neutrality and stave off threats of invasion by Winston Churchill. However, as time went on, Ireland's neutrality had been shaped and reshaped by imperialist forces that controlled the Southern Free State as the semi-colony that it is. What is left of Ireland's neutrality has been maintained by the real efforts of Irish citizens, as Simon likes to call us, in protesting against this aforementioned chipping away. Examples include routine protests at Shannon Airport against the use by the American military for stopovers, refuelling and rendition flights. Such protests are growing throughout the country as it becomes more and more apparent that the bourgeois comprador class in the current government wish to surrender what is left of Irish neutrality, despite the wishes of the vast majority of the people, as the Irish Times poll used by Simon has clearly shown. This video is not meant to incite pessimism, but to increase awareness of the role that everyone opposed to the proposed membership of Ireland in the NATO military alliance. That now is not the time for apathy, but for voicing their wishes in whatever way they are able to. Arguing with Gunther Fellinger on Twitter can only take us so far. Making this video has really taken me on a journey that I never envisioned myself going on, and really broadened my realization of what global imperialism is currently doing in terms of peddling propaganda to further its own agenda. If you've seen Paul Connolly's video, You're Being Manipulated by the State, you'll know that we're all being fed propaganda in everything that we consume, whether it's online or in mainstream media. Vigilance is of the utmost importance now more than ever. People peddling such propaganda need to be challenged, no matter how nuanced or neutral they may try to make themselves appear. No means of challenging such people is too big or too small, as Bobby Sands would most likely say himself.